Before I was elected to Congress, I was a mayor who had to balance a budget every year in a bipartisan fashion. And I was then, as I am now, accountable to taxpayers for every dollar spent, and nothing was more important to me than to be a good steward of the hard-earned tax dollars that we received. I believe that our $22 trillion debt is a bipartisan problem. Both parties are responsible for getting us into this mess. In 2017, we saw Republicans in the House jam through an irresponsible tax cut for the wealthy and the well-connected that added almost $2 trillion to our national debt total. They sold that tax to the public by saying, in part, that it would pay for itself, but most economists say that that is a myth. That additional $2 trillion simply piled onto the enormous economic burden we've created for future generations rather than achieve needed tax reform. Both Democrats and Republicans have acted in a way that suggests that the debt doesn't matter, but I'm here to say that I believe the debt does matter. Unfortunately, the interest on our national debt is now the fastest growing part of the federal budget. Next year, we will spend more on interest than all the federal funding for our kids. And by the year 2025, 6 years from now, our interest payments will exceed the cost of our defense budget. Growing interest payments will crowd out other investments that would move our country forward, such as education or housing or infrastructure. And not only is that fiscally irresponsible, I believe it's morally reprehensible to saddle generations yet unborn with those bills. And someday, those bills will come due. As has been said before, but still holds true today, the first rule when you find yourself in a deep hole is to stop digging. And that's why I was so critical in our first votes in the House on the rules package that we kept pay-as-you-go requirements. Every Utah family understands that when you decide to make a purchase, you must first show how you'll pay for it. Either you find additional revenue or you cut back on spending elsewhere so that you continue to live within your budget. When I was mayor, I consistently faced trade-offs. But you set your priorities and you make choices, and sometimes those are very difficult choices. Again, this is what hardworking Utah families in my district do every day when they sit at the kitchen table and balance their checkbooks, and Congress must do the same. As one of the co-chairs of the Blue Dog Task Force on Fiscal Responsibility and Government Reform, I'll be working with my colleagues and my fellow co-chair, Representative Ed Case, to pursue smart, strategic policies to rein in the federal government's persistent annual deficits and unsustainable debt. We will be responsible for crafting policies that increase transparency, hold Congress accountable to the taxpayers, and ensure that money is wisely spent. Another tool in our toolbox, I believe, must be a balanced budget amendment, and I hope to introduce legislation on this soon. The Blue Dog Coalition has championed this issue in the past, and I will work with members to advance this issue again in Congress. By generally prohibiting the federal government from spending more than it receives in a fiscal year, I think we can start to turn the Titanic of debt around. Lawmakers in both parties must take a hard look at both the revenue and the spending side of the ledger, while also protecting the Social Security and Medicare benefits that seniors have earned. The measure that I plan to introduce will have reasonable exceptions for things like times of war or severe economic downturn. I also support my fellow Representative Jim Cooper's no budget, no pay legislation. Everyone in this country understands that if you don't do your job on time, you won't get paid. The same rules should apply to Congress. If we don't pass a budget and the funding bills by October 1st, Congress shouldn't get paid. I also support taking a hard look at the return we've received from government programs to determine if we're getting good outcomes or just perpetuating spending with little or no results. We can do this by building a results-driven policy agenda and ensuring that scarce federal resources are invested in what works. They're invested more wisely using tax dollars and improving outcomes for young people, for their families, and for their communities. During my time as mayor, we launched several evidence-based programs to track and measure what outcomes the public received in return for spending their precious tax dollars. We evaluated programs and we improved and we reallocated dollars as appropriate. Now, national headlines say that no one in either political party is talking about the debt. We must have that conversation, and we must work until we find solutions to the harm that's caused by the debt. It's clear that our country is on a dangerous and unsustainable course, and it is past time for both parties to stop digging. The decisions, they won't be easy, but our children and our grandchildren are counting on us to make this right. Thank you for allowing me to testify.